You have until midnight. Every last thing out of that apartment, or I'm calling the police to remove you myself." The words landed in the hallway of 4200 Birchwood Court like something thrown. It was Christmas Eve. The corridor smelled of other people's dinners, cinnamon, roasting meat, the faint sweetness of someone's candles burning 2 doors down, and in that warmth, in that particular tenderness the last night before Christmas carries, a man named Gerald Marsh stood in his wool overcoat and said those words to a woman named Dorothy Caldwell. He said them loudly enough that the neighbors who had cracked their doors could hear every syllable. Dorothy was 58 years old. She stood in the doorway of apartment 4C with a cardboard box in her arms. A box she had not packed herself, but that Gerald's property manager had dropped inside her door that morning along with a printed notice. "Final notice," it said, though Dorothy had never received a first one she recognized as legitimate. Her coat was unbuttoned. Her reading glasses were pushed up on her forehead. She had been in the middle of wrapping a present for her son when the knock came. The neighbors watched. A young couple from 4A stood in their doorway with their hands at their sides. A woman from 4B held her phone loosely, not recording, not calling anyone, just watching. Gerald Marsh did not lower his voice. He did not look at the neighbors. He spoke only to Dorothy, and he spoke the way a man speaks when he has decided the outcome already. "This isn't a negotiation," he said. "This is a courtesy call. Midnight." He turned and walked back toward the elevator without waiting for her response. What Gerald Marsh did not know, what he could not have imagined standing in that hallway in his wool overcoat, was who Dorothy Caldwell's son was. What he did not know was where that son worked, and what that son was capable of doing with a single phone call. What he did not know was that the thing he had just set in motion on Christmas Eve, in front of witnesses, would not end at midnight. It would end with Gerald Marsh losing far more than he had ever intended to collect. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail is here for a reason. But before we get there, let me take you back to the beginning. Let me show you who Dorothy Caldwell really was, and who she had raised, and why Gerald Marsh had made the worst miscalculation of his professional life. Now, here is what most people in that building did not know about Dorothy Caldwell. She had lived at 4200 Birchwood Court for 11 years. 11 years of on-time rent, slid under the office door in a sealed envelope every first of the month, even the months when on time meant she skipped her own lunch for a week. She had moved into apartment 4C when her son Marcus was 17, when the neighborhood they had lived in before became a place she could no longer keep him safe, and she had chosen Birchwood Court specifically because it was the kind of building that looked from the outside like a promise. Clean hallways, a working intercom, a landlord, she was told, who maintained the units. Dorothy had grown up in Savannah, Georgia, the youngest daughter of a woman named Eunice Caldwell, who cleaned houses for a living and never once complained about it in front of her children. Eunice had a saying she repeated so often that Dorothy could hear it now in the original cadence in the exact register of her mother's voice. "You don't have to be loud to be powerful. You just have to be right, and you have to be ready." Dorothy had carried that sentence across 3 states and 4 decades. She had carried it through a marriage that ended too soon, and a grief that lasted longer than it should have, and a series of jobs: home health aide, school cafeteria supervisor, church bookkeeper, that paid just enough and never more. She had carried it into every room where someone looked past her, through her, or over her, and she had never once put it down. She had raised Marcus alone from the time he was 9. She had raised him on Eunice's maxim, and on the particular discipline of a woman who understood that the world does not extend credit to people who look like them, and so they had to build what they needed with what they had. Marcus had watched his mother budget and scrimp and study, earning her associate's degree in accounting at 44 while working full-time, taking the bus to the community college on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and coming home to make sure his homework was done before she looked at her own. He had watched her do all of it without fanfare, without complaint, without asking anyone to notice. He noticed. He had gone to college on a partial scholarship and a federal loan, and the money his mother saved in a coffee tin on the second shelf of the kitchen cabinet. Money she had been putting away since he was 12, $5 at a time, 20 when she could manage it. He had graduated with a degree in finance. He had gone to work quietly and methodically, and with the same invisible discipline his mother had taught him by example, rising in that work the way his grandmother Eunice would have recognized, not by making noise, but by being right and being ready. What he did for a living and for whom, that was the part Gerald Marsh did not know. That was the part that was about to matter enormously. Now let me tell you about Gerald Marsh and the world he believed he owned. Gerald Marsh was 61 years old and had been a residential landlord in the city for 22 years. He owned 14 properties across 4 zip codes, ranging from the Birchwood Court Building, 42 units, mid-range rent, working-class tenants, to a pair of renovated brownstones on the north side that he rented at rates that had doubled in 5 years. He drove a black Cadillac Escalade with a parking placard obtained through a contact at City Hall. He had his name on the donor wall of 2 local charities, which he mentioned in conversation more than was strictly necessary. Gerald had a property manager named Kevin Sloan, a thin, careful man of 34 who had worked for Gerald for 6 years and had learned in that time to execute Gerald's instructions without asking too many questions. Kevin was not a cruel man. He was a compliant one, which in practice produced similar results. Gerald's relationship to his tenants was one of categorical distance. He did not learn their names unless a problem required it. He communicated through Kevin and through printed notices and through the particular authority of a man who knows that the people who need something from him are in a structurally weaker position, and who has organized his entire professional life around that asymmetry. His accountant had once described his expression toward tenants, privately, as the look of a man who has already decided the outcome. Not malice, exactly. Settled certainty. The look of a man who has never been surprised by the world. What he believed about Dorothy Caldwell without having met her more than twice in 11 years was a thing he would never have said aloud. But it was visible in the way he handled her file, in the way he had approved Kevin's notices without reading them carefully, in the way he had decided, when a developer named Hargrove Capital approached him about purchasing the Birchwood Court building in the fall, that the fastest path to a clean sale was to reduce occupancy, and that the tenants most likely to receive cash for keys offers first were the ones in longer-term units, the ones whose leases were month to month, the ones who, Gerald calculated, would have the fewest resources to push back. Dorothy's unit was month to month, had been for 3 years, since her last annual lease expired and Gerald's office had simply never sent a renewal. That had not been an accident. The eviction notice Kevin delivered on December 23rd cited a lease violation, specifically an unauthorized occupant. The unauthorized occupant was Marcus, who had stayed in his mother's apartment for 2 weeks in November while his own place was being treated for mold. 14 days. He had slept on the pull-out sofa, bought his mother groceries, and fixed the bathroom faucet that Kevin's maintenance team had been promising to repair for 4 months. Then he had gone home. Gerald's notice cited his presence as a material breach. The notice gave Dorothy 9 days to vacate. 9 days, which carried her exactly to Christmas Eve. Dorothy had called the tenant advocacy line the day she received the notice. She had spoken to a paralegal named Renata Osei, a young woman of 26 who had grown up in the same kind of building Dorothy now lived in, and who understood, with a precision born of personal experience, exactly what this notice was and was not. Renata reviewed the lease, reviewed the notice, and told Dorothy clearly that the eviction lacked proper legal foundation. A 14-day guest stay did not constitute an unauthorized occupant under the city's housing code, and the notice period itself was procedurally deficient. Dorothy had listened carefully. She had written down what Renata told her. She had thanked her, hung up the phone, and then sat at her kitchen table for a long time, her hands flat on the surface, looking at the small wreath she had hung in the window. She had not panicked. Eunice Caldwell had not raised a woman who panicked. She had called Marcus. Marcus listened without interrupting. When his mother finished, he asked one question. "Did you save all the notices, Mom?" She had. She kept every piece of paper that came through her door in a manila folder in the second drawer of her filing cabinet, organized by date, because Eunice had taught her that paper is memory, and memory is evidence. Marcus said he would handle it. Quietly, without elaboration, in the same tone his mother used when she meant something absolutely. What Gerald Marsh did not know, standing in that hallway on Christmas Eve delivering his midnight ultimatum to a woman holding a cardboard box, what he genuinely, completely did not know, was that Marcus Caldwell was a senior compliance officer at the city's largest federally chartered bank. That Marcus's bank held the primary commercial mortgage on 2 of Gerald Marsh's 14 properties, including the Birchwood Court building itself. That Marcus, in the course of his daily work, reviewed loan portfolios, assessed landlord risk profiles, and flagged accounts for regulatory review. Gerald had been a customer of that bank for 9 years. He had no idea. And it was about to get considerably worse. The night of December 24th, after Gerald Marsh had delivered his ultimatum and walked back to the elevator, and the neighbors had quietly closed their doors, Dorothy Caldwell did not pack. She sat down at her kitchen table and finished wrapping her son's present, a leather-bound journal, because Marcus had kept a journal since he was 14, a habit she had encouraged because she believed that a man who writes down what he sees will never be able to pretend he didn't see it. She wrapped it in green paper with a gold ribbon. She set it under the small tree in the corner of the living room. And then she went to bed. She did not call anyone. She did not post anything. She did not raise her voice or her hands or her heart rate in the direction of Gerald Marsh or his ultimatum. She had raised a son who knew what to do, and she trusted him to do it. Marcus had been on the phone for 2 hours by the time his mother went to sleep. Not with Gerald Marsh, not with Kevin Sloan. With Renata Osei, who agreed to prepare an emergency filing for the morning of the 26th. With his own attorney, a woman named Claudia Park, who specialized in tenant protection law and who, when Marcus explained the situation, said 4 words. This one is straightforward. And, with one other person, a conversation that would not produce results until after the holiday, but that Marcus understood would produce them with certainty, because he knew how institutions worked, and he knew what happened when the right person inside one looked carefully at the right file. He had not called that person in anger. He had not called them for revenge. He had called them because the facts warranted it, and because he had spent his entire career believing that facts, properly documented and properly presented, were the most powerful thing a person could hold. His grandmother Eunice would have agreed. The 26th of December arrived cold and clear. The sky, the particular pale blue of winter mornings that have no sympathy for unfinished business. Renata Osei filed the emergency motion at 9:15. The filing documented 3 separate procedural deficiencies in the eviction notice, cited the City Housing Code's specific guest day provision, and attached a timeline of Dorothy's 11-year tenancy with a complete rent payment record reconstructed from her manila folder and her bank statements, every month accounted for, not one payment late. The filing also noted, in a separate paragraph, that the eviction had been initiated 9 days after a developer's preliminary purchase agreement for the Birchwood Court building had been recorded with the county. Renata had identified this by pulling public records the morning after Dorothy called her. She had not mentioned it to Dorothy. She had simply placed it in the filing, because a fact inside a legal document is a different kind of fact than one spoken aloud. The motion landed on the desk of a housing court magistrate named Judge Elaine Forsythe, who had been on the bench for 17 years and who read it the way you read something you already understand, quickly, checking each element against a pattern she recognized. She issued a temporary stay of the eviction by 10:45. Kevin Sloan called Gerald to tell him. Gerald was at his sister's house in the suburbs and received the news with the particular irritation of a man who has never been told no by a system he assumed was on his side. He told Kevin to call their attorney. He said it would be resolved by the new year. He was wrong about that, because what was happening on the 26th was not only happening in housing court. Inside the commercial lending division of Marcus Caldwell's bank, a loan portfolio analyst named James Whitfield, a careful, deliberate man of 41, who had worked 2 desks down from Marcus for 3 years and who had been the person Marcus called on the evening of the 24th, had opened the account file for Gerald Marsh's 2 bank-held mortgages and begun reading. Not because Marcus had told him to find something, because Marcus had simply said, "I think it's worth a careful look." James understood what that meant. He read carefully. He flagged what he found. He forwarded the file with his notes to the bank's Compliance Review Committee, exactly the channel the bank's internal policy required for accounts meeting that threshold. He had done nothing improper. He had done his job. And that was the part Gerald Marsh had never considered possible. The morning of December 27th arrived quietly, without ceremony, as though the world had not registered what had been set in motion 2 days before. The hallway of 4200 Birchwood Court smelled of old carpet and radiator heat. That particular dry warmth that comes from pipes working harder than they should in buildings not properly maintained in years. Dorothy Caldwell stood at her kitchen window with a cup of coffee, watching the street below, and felt something she had not expected. Not relief. Not victory. Something quieter than either. The feeling of a woman who has done what she was taught to do, and who now waits, without fear, for the world to catch up. She had spoken to Marcus the night before. He had told her, in the careful and measured way he told her everything, that the emergency stay had been granted. That Claudia Park had confirmed the procedural deficiencies were sufficient to invalidate the notice entirely. That the timeline Renata had identified was now part of the court record. Dorothy had listened. She had said, "All right." And then she had asked him whether he had eaten dinner, because she was still his mother, and that was still the most important question. He had laughed. A short, warm sound. She had not. The small tree in the corner of the living room still held its lights, still held the gold-ribboned present she had wrapped on Christmas Eve while Gerald Marsh's deadline hung in the air above her. She had not opened it. It was for Marcus. She would give it to him when he came, and she intended to make a proper meal and sit across the table from him and not talk about any of this for at least an hour. But the story was not over, not by a considerable distance. Gerald Marsh received the news of the temporary stay through his attorney, a man named Douglas Pratt, who had handled Gerald's legal matters for 14 years and who communicated in the precise affect-neutral language of someone who has learned that delivering bad news with too much expression increases the number of phone calls he receives. Douglas told Gerald the stay was temporary, the eviction could still be pursued, and the developer timeline Renata had included was a complication, but not necessarily a fatal one. He used the word complication 3 times. Gerald heard it and filed it away in the place where he stored things he intended to resolve and then forgot about. He told Douglas to proceed, with certainty, with the quiet authority of a man who has never been made to feel the weight of a decision already made. He did not yet know about James Whitfield. He did not yet know what James Whitfield had found. Here is what the Compliance Review Committee found when they opened Gerald Marsh's account file on the morning of December 27th. The Birchwood Court building carried a commercial mortgage with a covenant requiring the borrower to maintain the property in habitable condition and comply with all applicable housing codes. The committee found, in the bank's own inspection records the bank was contractually entitled to require and had required twice in the past 4 years, evidence of deferred maintenance violations that Gerald had been notified of and had not remediated within the required time frame. They found that Gerald had applied for and received a loan modification processed on the basis of occupancy projections that were now, in light of the developer's preliminary purchase agreement, worth a careful second look. They found that the preliminary purchase agreement itself had not been disclosed to the bank as a material change in the borrower's circumstances as the loan covenant required. 3 things, each one individually addressable, each one individually the kind of thing that gets a letter and a tense phone call with a loan officer. Together, they were something else. Together, they constituted what the committee's written summary would describe in the dry and devastating language of institutional finance as a pattern of covenant non-compliance warranting a formal review of the bank's continued relationship with the borrower. The letter went out on December 28th. It informed Gerald that his accounts had been placed under formal review, that draw privileges on both loan lines had been suspended pending the review's conclusion, and that he was required to respond in writing within 15 business days. Gerald received it by certified mail on December 30th. He read it standing at his kitchen counter. He read it twice. Then he set it down and stood very still, the way a man stands when the floor has shifted beneath him and he is not yet certain how far it will shift. He called Douglas Pratt. Douglas read the letter and was quiet for longer than usual before he spoke. When he did not use the word complication. He used a different word. He said it was serious. He said it twice. Gerald asked if this had anything to do with the Caldwell matter. Douglas said he didn't know. Gerald said he wanted to know. Douglas said he would make inquiries. What he learned, through the careful and procedurally appropriate channels available to an attorney making such inquiries, was only that the review had been initiated through the bank's internal compliance division following a standard flag. He could not learn who had flagged it. He was not entitled to that information. The bank's process was exactly as opaque as it was designed to be, and it had been designed that way by people who understood that the integrity of a compliance review depends on the integrity of the process that generates it. Douglas reported back that he could not determine the origin of the flag. Gerald said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "The tenant's son. What does he do?" Douglas did not know. He had never asked. Gerald had never told him, because Gerald had never known and had never thought to find out, because Gerald Marsh had spent 22 years operating on the assumption that the people who rented from him were not the kind of people who could reach him where he lived professionally. That assumption had been the organizing principle of his business. For 22 years, it had been correct. It was no longer correct. Douglas made a different inquiry. It took less than an hour. He called Gerald back and said 4 words. "He works at the bank." Gerald said nothing. "Senior compliance officer," Douglas said. 7 years. The silence on Gerald's end lasted long enough that Douglas said his name to confirm he was still on the line. He was still on the line, standing at his kitchen counter with the bank's letter in front of him and the particular cold of a man who has understood, all at once and too late, the full geometry of what he has done. He had delivered a midnight eviction ultimatum on Christmas Eve to the mother of a senior compliance officer at the bank that held the mortgage on the building he was trying to evict her from. He had done it loudly, in a hallway, in front of witnesses. He had done it on the basis of a procedurally deficient notice that a housing court magistrate had already stayed. He had done it 9 days after signing a preliminary purchase agreement he had not disclosed to the bank. He had done all of it. And the only person who had responded with anything resembling restraint was Dorothy Caldwell, who had stood in her doorway holding a cardboard box and said nothing at all. Gerald Marsh had a property manager named Kevin Sloan, a thin and careful man who had spent 6 years learning to execute Gerald's instructions without asking too many questions. Kevin had delivered the eviction notice. Kevin had dropped the cardboard box inside Dorothy's door. He had done these things because Gerald had told him to, and because he had learned that the cost of asking questions was higher than the cost of compliance. But Kevin Sloan had also grown up in a neighborhood not unlike the one Dorothy Caldwell had moved away from when Marcus was 17. He had grown up in a building not unlike 4200 Birchwood Court. He had grown up knowing what an eviction notice felt like when it arrived through a door, and he had spent 6 years setting that knowledge aside because the salary was steady and the work was familiar. And he had told himself, more than once, that he was not the one making the decisions. He had believed it less and less. On the morning of December 27th, before the Compliance Committee's letter had been drafted, Kevin Sloan had pulled Dorothy Caldwell's tenant file. Not to find more ammunition, to read it. 11 years of rent receipts, 11 years of maintenance requests, many bearing the notation "resolved" in Gerald's system, though Kevin knew from personal knowledge that several had not been. He had read the eviction notice he himself had prepared and delivered, and he had sat at his desk for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called Renata Osei. He had not identified himself as Gerald's property manager at first. He said he had information relevant to the Caldwell eviction. Renata listened. She had learned in 2 years at the Tenant Advocacy Office to listen carefully to anonymous callers, because anonymous callers sometimes carried the kind of information that only exists inside the machine. Kevin told her about the developer's timeline, not 9 days before the notice, but 6 weeks, which meant the preliminary purchase agreement in the public record was not the beginning of the developer relationship, but a later formalization of it. He told her about 4 maintenance requests in Dorothy's file that bore the resolved notation but had never been addressed. He told her about 2 other long-term tenants in the building who had received similar notices in the past 3 months, both month to month, both in units that would command higher rents after renovation. He told her all of it. Then he gave her his name. Renata had written everything down. She thanked him. She asked if he understood what disclosing this information might mean for his employment. Kevin said he understood. Without hesitation, in the voice of a man who has been waiting a long time to stop hesitating, Renata added Kevin's disclosure to a supplemental filing the following morning. Judge Elaine Forsyth read it the way she read the original, quickly, against a pattern she recognized, with the focused attention of someone who has seen this geometry before and knows what it means when the pieces align. She did not rule immediately. She scheduled a hearing for the 2nd week of January. And she issued a preservation order requiring Gerald Marsh to retain all communications, financial records, and internal documents related to the Birchwood Court building dating back 18 months. Gerald's attorney received the preservation order on December 31st. New Year's Eve. Gerald was at a dinner when Douglas called. He stepped away from the table into the cold of the restaurant's small foyer and listened to Douglas explain what a preservation order meant, what the supplemental filing contained, and what the disclosure of the developer's 6-week timeline implied about the eviction's actual motivation. Douglas did not use the word complication this time. He said, "Gerald, we have a problem." Gerald stood in that foyer in his wool overcoat, the cold coming through the glass door behind him, the sound of other people's celebration audible through the wall, and for the first time in 22 years of residential landlording, he felt the floor shift in a way he could not calculate his way around. Certainty had been the organizing principle of his professional life. The thing that made him walk away from conversations before they were finished. The thing that made him deliver midnight ultimatums on Christmas Eve to women holding cardboard boxes. The thing that made him look at tenants as though the outcome were already decided. The outcome was no longer decided. It had been decided, just not by him. He went back to the dinner table. He sat down. He picked up his fork. He said nothing to the people around him, because there was nothing he could say that would not make it worse, and because the particular discipline of a man in free fall is to appear, for as long as possible, as though he is still standing. He did not sleep that night. The new year arrived without his permission, the way New Years always do, indifferent to the plans of the people it finds still awake and reckoning with what they have done. The hearing was set for January 9th. Judge Forsyth's courtroom was on the 4th floor of the city's municipal building, a room that smelled of old wood and central heating and the particular institutional patience of a space that has absorbed decades of argument without taking sides. Gerald Marsh arrived with Douglas Pratt at his left shoulder and a leather portfolio under his arm, and the residual posture of a man who still believed, despite everything, that rooms like this one could be managed with preparation and presence and settled certainty. He was wrong about that. Dorothy Caldwell arrived 12 minutes before the hearing began. She wore a dark blue coat and her reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she carried the manila folder from the second drawer of her filing cabinet. 11 years of receipts, organized by date, every month accounted for, not one payment late. Renata Osei sat to her left. Claudia Park sat to her right. Marcus sat in the gallery, one row behind, in a gray suit and a tie the color of winter sky. He had taken the morning off. He had told his supervisor only that he had a family matter to attend to. He did not look at Gerald Marsh when Gerald entered the room. He did not need to. Judge Forsythe entered at 9 o'clock precisely, and the room settled into the quiet of a space about to hear something important. She reviewed the filings. She asked Douglas Pratt 3 questions about the timeline between the developer's first contact with Gerald and the issuance of the eviction notice, and Douglas answered them in the careful, affect-neutral language of a man who has realized, too late, that the facts he is being asked to explain do not arrange themselves into an innocent story, no matter how carefully he chooses his words. She asked Gerald directly whether the eviction notice had been issued in connection with the anticipated sale of the Birchwood Court building to Hargrove Capital. Gerald said it had not. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the supplemental filing. She did not need to say what the look meant. Everyone in the room understood it. The ruling took 11 minutes. Judge Forsythe voided the eviction notice on 3 separate procedural grounds. She found, additionally, that the evidence in the record, the developer timeline, the pattern of notices to long-term month-to-month tenants, Kevin Sloan's disclosure, was sufficient to support a finding of retaliatory eviction under the city's Tenant Protection Ordinance. She referred the matter to the city's Housing Enforcement Division for investigation. She awarded Dorothy Caldwell 3 months' rent and damages, payable within 30 days, and ordered Gerald Marsh to provide a renewed 12-month lease at the existing rent rate, with all outstanding maintenance requests addressed within 60 days under penalty of additional sanctions. She said all of this in the same measured, unhurried voice she used for every ruling. She did not editorialize. She simply stated what the evidence required and what the law provided, and she moved on to the next matter on her docket. That was all it took. Certainty. Not Dorothy's anger. Not Marcus's position. Not Kevin's courage, though Kevin's courage had mattered enormously. What it took was the patient accumulation of documented fact, organized in a manila folder in the second drawer of a filing cabinet by a woman who had learned from her mother that paper is memory, and memory is evidence. Eunice Caldwell had been right about that. She had been right about most things. The bank's compliance review concluded on January 21st. The committee's final report documented the 3 covenant violations, the undisclosed material change in borrower circumstances, and what it described, in language that was precise and devastating and entirely without malice, as a pattern of conduct inconsistent with the bank's lending standards and community reinvestment obligations. The bank did not renew Gerald Marsh's commercial mortgages. It called both loans, effective 60 days from the date of the letter. Gerald had 60 days to refinance or sell. He could not refinance. No institution he approached would touch the accounts once the compliance review's findings became part of his credit record, and in the world of commercial real estate lending, a finding of that kind travels faster than any landlord's phone calls can follow it. He sold. Not to Hargrove Capital, whose preliminary agreement had quietly dissolved once the legal proceedings became public and the property's clean title became uncertain. He sold to a different buyer at a price considerably below what Hargrove had offered, because a building under active housing enforcement investigation and a court order for maintenance remediation does not command premium pricing. The sale closed in March. Gerald Marsh walked away from Birchwood Court with less than he had calculated, and a record that would follow him into every future transaction he attempted in this city. He did not lose everything, but he lost enough that the loss was the kind a man feels in his posture, in the way he holds a room, in the particular confidence that had been the organizing principle of his professional life for 22 years. That confidence did not come back. Kevin Sloan was terminated on January 10th, the morning after the hearing. Gerald called him and said 4 words, "Don't come in Monday." Kevin said he understood, without surprise, in the voice of a man who chose a consequence and is prepared to carry it. He had saved every text message, every email, every written instruction Gerald had sent him over 6 years. He provided them all to the Housing Enforcement Division's investigator when she called the following week. He cooperated completely. He answered every question. He did not embellish, and he did not minimize. He simply told the truth in the organized and detailed way of a man who has decided the truth is the only thing worth offering. Renata Osei filed a separate complaint on behalf of the 2 other long-term tenants who had received similar notices. Both eviction proceedings were voided. Both tenants remained in their apartments. The Housing Enforcement Division's investigation into Gerald Marsh's properties produced findings submitted to the city attorney's office in February. The city attorney determined that the pattern of conduct documented across multiple properties and multiple tenants constituted a violation of the city's Fair Housing Ordinance. The matter was referred for civil prosecution. The civil case was filed in March. It named Gerald Marsh personally. It sought damages, injunctive relief, and the revocation of his residential landlord license. Douglas Pratt told him, in the careful and affect-neutral language he had used for 14 years, that the exposure was significant. He said it twice. Gerald understood what it meant the second time. He settled. Because Douglas told him the alternative was worse, and because the particular discipline of a man watching his professional world disassemble itself is to cut the loss before there's nothing left to cut. The settlement required him to pay restitution to affected tenants, fund a remediation escrow for the properties he still held, and submit to a 3-year monitoring agreement with the city's housing authority. His landlord license was placed on probationary status. 1 additional violation, and it would be revoked permanently. He agreed to all of it, in writing, in a room with lawyers, without ceremony and without the wool overcoat he had worn on Christmas Eve when he believed the outcome was already decided. The outcome had been decided, just not by him. Renata Osei was offered a staff attorney position at the Tenant Advocacy Organization in April, contingent on her completing the bar exam she had already been studying for. She passed in July. She took the position. She continued working cases and buildings exactly like 4200 Birchwood Court for tenants exactly like Dorothy Caldwell, with the same patient precision she had brought to the original filing. Kevin Sloan found new work in the spring, with a property management company whose owner had built her portfolio specifically around affordable housing preservation. She had read about the Birchwood Court case in the local housing advocacy newsletter and called Kevin directly. She said she needed someone who understood how buildings worked from the inside and who had demonstrated, in the clearest possible way, that they understood the difference between executing instructions and doing what was right. Kevin took the job. He was good at it. He had always been good at it. Dorothy Caldwell stayed in apartment 4C. The maintenance requests were addressed within the 60-day window the court had ordered, not by Gerald's crew, but by the new property management company that took over after the sale closed in March. The bathroom faucet was fixed. The hallway carpet was replaced. The intercom, intermittently broken for 2 years, was repaired and worked reliably for the first time since Dorothy had moved in. She noticed. The way a woman notices things that have been wrong for a long time and are finally, quietly, right. Marcus came for dinner in late January, on a Sunday, and Dorothy made a proper meal, and they sat across the table from each other and did not talk about any of it for the first hour, exactly as she had intended. She gave him the journal then, the leather-bound one she had wrapped in green paper with a gold ribbon on Christmas Eve while Gerald Marsh's deadline hung in the air. Marcus held it for a moment before he opened it. He ran his thumb along the spine. He looked at his mother. She said, "Your grandmother always said a man who writes down what he sees can never pretend he didn't see it." Marcus said, "I know, Mom." He did know. He had always known. Now, I want to say something directly before we close. What happened to Dorothy Caldwell happens every day. Not always in a hallway on Christmas Eve. Not always with a wool overcoat and a midnight ultimatum. Sometimes it's a lease that never gets renewed. Sometimes it is a maintenance request that stays open for 4 months. Sometimes it is a look. The look of a man who has already decided the outcome, who has organized his entire professional life around the assumption that the people who need something from him are not the kind of people who can reach him where he lives. That assumption is what this story is really about. Not the bank, not the compliance review, not the legal proceedings, though all of those things mattered. The thing this story is about is the assumption. The assumption that a woman with a cardboard box and reading glasses on her forehead and 11 years of on-time rent is someone who can be handed a midnight deadline and made to disappear quietly. Dorothy did not disappear. She stood in her doorway and said nothing and went inside and wrapped a present and went to bed and trusted the things she had built, in her son, in her documents, in the quiet discipline of a woman taught by her mother that you don't have to be loud to be powerful. You just have to be right, and you have to be ready. She was both. Gerald Marsh had every advantage. 22 years, 14 properties, a lawyer on retainer and a parking placard, and his name on 2 donor walls. The settled certainty of a man who has never been surprised by the world. He was surprised, not because Dorothy fought back. She didn't. Not because Marcus made a call in anger. He didn't. Because they had done the quiet work for years and years of being right and being ready, and when the moment came, the facts spoke for themselves. That is the thing about restraint. It is not passivity. It is not defeat. It is the discipline of a person who understands that the most powerful thing in a room is not the loudest voice. It is the most documented truth. I think about Eunice Caldwell sometimes, a woman I never met who cleaned houses for a living and raised a daughter who raised a son who changed the outcome of a story Gerald Marsh thought he had already finished writing. Eunice never knew any of this would happen. She just taught her daughter to be right and to be ready and to write it down. That was enough. It was more than enough. Here is the question I want to leave you with. If Marcus had been anything other than what he was, if he had worked a different job, carried a different title, had a different kind of access, would any of this have ended the same way? Would the filing have mattered? Would the stay have held? Would the room have shifted? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to hear what you think. Because I think about that question, and I think it matters more than the story itself. If this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to keep finding the people the world overlooked, the ones who built everything in silence, who never asked anyone to notice, who were right and ready when it counted, subscribe, and we will keep telling these stories.